Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this intro video. Welcome back to Art House Cinema, Series 8. And we're going to talk a little bit today about May Wong and our film that we're going to screen this week, The Daughter of Shanghai, 1937. So as I mentioned in our discussion last week, it's a short film. I think it's only about an hour long, and it is a B movie, so the production values are pretty low. But, you know, that's not why we're watching it. So first of all, it's a crime drama film, but were very popular in the 30s, probably the most popular genre, maybe comedy. Comedy's always kind of the most popular genre, but crime drama films were very popular in the 30s, as you probably are aware. That's when all the gangster films came out, and we met Edward G. Robinson and James Cagney and all these great gangster type actors. So this is one of those, and it's set in Chinatown, which many films in that era were. But as I have alluded to in our discussion, it's a very different kind of film because it's one of the only, I'm trying to think if there's any other, there might be one other film that isn't, that doesn't play on race stereotypes. Particularly Asian stereotypes. There might be one other one, I haven't checked it out yet. But as far as our discussion today, this is one of the only, if not the only, major studio release, Paramount Pictures release of a film that has two Asian actors as the leads. And they are not playing stereotypes. So this is, of course, very unusual for this time, very progressive. It was very unusual for almost any time. I mean, we can go all the way up through the 60s and see, Mickey Rooney in his terrible yellow face in Breakfast at Tiffany's. And we still don't have a lot of Asian leads in mainstream films. It's getting better, and there's a lot of stuff on television and cable, but for main films, we still have a problem in this area, obviously, in Hollywood. So in 1937, to cast an actual Asian actor in an Asian role and make them a lead and not some kind of servant or a villain, which is really the only two kinds of roles that they were mostly given, the only kinds of characters that were mostly written for Asian actors. It's highly unusual. It's a very progressive idea, and I think you're going to find it fascinating to see this film. And as I sort of also alluded to in our discussion last week, I just think, wow, where would we maybe be now as a culture if we just kept doing this? Why didn't we just keep doing this, you know? I know that there were, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but, there were terrible laws on the books for interracial, against interracial miscegenation relationships. So, the argument always was, well, we can't cast an actual Asian male or female in the lead part because, especially if they were going to have some kind of relationship and that other character were white, you couldn't have that. So you would have to cast a white actor in yellow face, and then they could have the relationship on screen with the other white character. And I guess they just never had two Asian characters in a relationship that were leads. I mean, they didn't. They weren't a big focus, right? It was all, Hollywood's always preferred white characters and white actors. So anyway, we will get a little more into that as we go on. Our film, if I haven't mentioned it yet, is The Daughter of Shanghai. I don't think, did I? Well, maybe I did. I don't have a lot to say about that film other than this aspect of it. So what I want to do is talk more about the actors in the film and the context, the era in which they lived, in which they had to struggle through to make this kind of film. So as I've already just mentioned, that whenever you had a non-white character in films, certainly in the Hays Code censorship era films, this was a little bit different prior to the censorship code, right? Like in the early silent era, you could kind of almost do whatever you wanted, and then we passed the censorship code. We wrote it in 1930, and then they started enacting it, and it really went into effect in 1934. So after that, you couldn't have any kind of interracial relationships and whatnot. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of examples in the silent era when things were more liberal and progressive, and then they got tamped down. But for the most part, throughout the 30s and 40s and later until we got into the modern era, anytime you would have a non-white character in a film, they were almost never the lead, certainly not in the early days of film. And they were, each community, whether it was the Black community or the Asian community, the Hispanic community, all had their own kind of stereotypical caricatures, right, that Hollywood really embraced and propagated in our culture. And this is why I said, if we had just kept making films like the one we're going to see this week, I can't imagine how it would have affected our culture. And anyone who thinks it wouldn't have is wrong, because many people, and even today, learn things from film, whether the film is trying to teach them the thing or not. And certainly back in the early days when there were white communities all over the country in which people had never seen someone who wasn't white, they go to the film, the cinema, and they see these caricatures of Black people and Mexican people and Asians, and they go, oh, that's who that is. And then they believe that, and people still do that. People still believe what they see in film. So Hollywood is a very powerful medium. Film is a very powerful medium. I think, it's been written about. It's even a more powerful image maker than literature or art. So incredibly important that we always be discerning with what we put on screen, whether it's big screen or little screen, and often we're not discerning. Often we're just out to make money. So nonetheless, we had these terrible stereotypes of people of color, and they were usually, portrayed as stupid or lazy or bumbling, or on the other end of the spectrum, just these deceitful, conniving, evil demons, these villains. And that was kind of it. And they were servants as well, and that was all we had. So that's what peppered all early film, except films like the one we're going to see. And the actors of color were put in terrible positions, right? Because they were given the choice: you play a stereotype or you don't play at all. You just don't get to be an actor. And so we have to really consider that these actors of color across the board, they really were artists. They really wanted to work in this medium, to the point that they would humiliate themselves and alienate themselves from their communities and receive terrible press. Hattie McDaniel, of course, received terrible criticism from the Black press at the time for playing caricatures, mammies, and things like that. And May Wong, who's our star in our film this week, was completely ostracized by the Chinese press, both from China and within the United States, for playing stereotypes. And again, these two actresses in particular, and I'm sure all of the actors of color, fought constantly to not be stereotypes, but they didn't have the power. So they either worked in these roles or they didn't work at all. Later in film, one of the roles that you could have as a person of color would be an entertainer, and that was, of course, less humiliating than being a servant or some terrible caricature. But you were just there to amuse the white characters in the film and the white audience members. And often when you were an entertainer character, you would have a featured number that you would do, and you never really got to interact with any of the other characters in the film. It was kind of this offset, entertain us, you person of color, and then we'll go back to the regular story, that we really care about with our white lead characters. So it was really terrible, really awful. So the particular stereotype that was placed upon Asian Americans and in particular Chinese and Japanese Americans and actors was this idea of the yellow peril, a hideous, grotesque caricature of Asian people. It really emerged starting about 1875 in this country. Actually, I think it was in Europe that emerged, and then it quickly moved over here and was embraced by Americans. And the idea of the yellow peril was that all of these Asian people were a threat to Western society, aka white society, especially its white women. And they were going to all get band together, all of the Asian people, Korean, Japanese, Chinese, everybody was going to band together and come over here and take over our country. Sounds very plausible, doesn't it? And they were going to take our white women and rape our white women and sell them into sex trafficking. So it's always the white women, right? They were always said that black men were trying to take the white women and give them reefers, and that was in the jazz age, right? Don't let your white women smoke pot because they'll go out with black jazz music. I mean, just what's with the white women being the prize of this country? It's very sick. It's sick in the head, and it has so that was used against every group of color, every community of color. You know, don't touch our white women. So we had this yellow peril, and it was so bad in the late 19th century that there was a series of racist legislation that was passed in the US, so including the Page Act of 1875, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and the Geary Act of 1892. And all of these legislative bills severely limited the civil rights and immigration of any Asian person in this country or trying to come to this country. And it's so bizarre because only 30 years earlier, in 1868, we had the Burlingame Treaty, which was signed between the United States and China, that encouraged Chinese migration. And it actually declared that China was the favored nation of the United States for trade and everything else. And it said, please send your Chinese immigrant people over, and we'll send Americans over, and let's do this cultural exchange. And it basically, part of it in the treaty, it was written, citizens of the United States in China of every religious persuasion and Chinese subjects in the United States shall enjoy entire liberty of conscience and shall be exempt from all disability or persecution on account of their religious faith or worship in either country. So it was like this protection. And the only thing it didn't do was grant citizenship to immigrants. But it was, so then 30 years after that, by the late 1880s, Chinese citizens were being outright massacred in this country, and not just by rogue, regular citizens, but by actual public officials. In the Western U.S., the frequency with which racists lynched Chinese people it was so frequent that the phrase having a Chinaman's chance in hell was originated, meaning, of course, you have no chance at all of surviving any kind of false accusation. In Tombstone, Arizona, Sheriff Johnny Behan and Mayor John Clum organized the Anti-Chinese League in 1880, and that same year, the Yellow Peril Pogrom of Denver, Colorado, featured the lynching of a Chinese man and the destruction of the local Chinatown ghetto. In 1885, the Rock Springs Massacre of 28 miners destroyed a Wyoming Chinese community, and in Washington Territory, the attack on Squaw Valley Chinese laborers, the arson of the Seattle Chinatown, and the Tacoma riot of 1885 occurred. And in that last one, the local white inhabitants expelled the Chinese community from their towns. It goes on. It's an epidemic. In Seattle, the Knights of Labor expelled 200 Chinese people with the Seattle riot of 1886, and in Oregon, 34 Chinese gold miners were ambushed, robbed, and killed in the Hell's Canyon Massacre of 1887. In the early 20th century, all Asian men and women were excluded from American citizenship, and the Nativist Immigration Act of 1917 barred all Asian immigration. So that's where we were. And that's the time period in which Anna May Wong was born in this country, American citizen. This is the context, and all of this racism against Asian people, and particularly Chinese people at this time, it transferred into film, of course. So in the silent film era, Chinese citizens were often the subject of just ire or outright terror, especially when filmmakers began adopting that mythological sex trafficking idea of white women. So it was white slavery, and they just, even in the film, the 1960s film, Thoroughly Modern Millie, starring Julie Andrews and Mary Tyler Moore and Carol Channing, which is a hilarious, super fun film, except for the fact that there's this whole second storyline about white slavery and how the Chinese woman who runs the hotel is stealing all of these single white girls, Mary Tyler Moore being one of them, and putting them into sex slavery. Now, this is the 1960s, which is weird, it's a period piece. I should have mentioned that's a period piece of the 1920s and 30s. So I guess, in the 60s, they thought, well, that was the popular theme back then, so let's use it in our modern film, and they didn't have the modern sensibility yet to think, oh, this might be quite offensive to anyone watching, although accurate, perhaps, to history. All right. And again, it wasn't really happening in the past. It was a myth. It was, used to scare people and to support racist ideas, like they always are, making up things about other people, so that white people are terrified of them and then are justified attacking them. Okay, we all know. I guess I don't have to keep going over that. So in film also, a little later on, like in the 1930s, we still had the yellow peril, but it was a little bit more, I wouldn't say subtle, but it was less violent. So instead of white sex trafficking of white women, we had these, again, as I sort of mentioned earlier, these white actors just portraying Chinese characters, and we really only had these stereotypical lead Chinese characters. So for example, Asian detectives Charlie Chan, who was played by Warner Oland, a white man, and Mr. Moto, right, who was played by Peter Lorre. These were originally literary detectives in novels and comic strips, and they had to be portrayed at that time, apparently, by white men to make them socially acceptable. So I'll never get my head around that. I never will. I don't think most of us will, but that's how it was. Likewise, female Asian characters were portrayed as tropes like the China doll and the dragon lady, and of course many of these roles, especially if they were integral and center pieces of a story, were also played by white actresses. For example, as Myrna Loy as Fu Manchu's sadistic daughter in The Mask of Fu Manchu. Even in early films that had Asian settings, right, that were supposedly taking place in China or similar nations, similar Asian nations, like Joseph von Sternberg's Shanghai Express in 1932, or William Wyler's The Letter in 1940, or even Orson Welles' film The Lady from Shanghai in 1947. All of these films focused on the white female lead, respectively, Marlene Dietrich, Bette Davis, and Rita Hayworth. And any Asian women in the film were relegated to the sidelines, particularly, and even in The Letter, Gail Sondergaard played the Eurasian villainess, and she wasn't even at all Asian in her ethnicity in real life. And the only Shanghai Express really was different from those three because May Wong was in it, and it was in 1932, so that's pre-code. And she really held her own against Marlene Dietrich. In fact, there was a lot of, the press was a flurry with rumors and speculation because the scenes between Dietrich and Wong were so intense and kind of sexually charged, and that, they wondered if they had had an affair because, of course, Dietrich slept with everyone. Didn't matter. So I don't know. That'd be fun. But they just were great together on screen, and it's probably the reason to watch Shanghai Express, which falls apart in other parts of the film. There were some instances, as I mentioned earlier, when an Asian actor was able to break through that racial barrier, but mostly this happened pre-code. And I want to tell you just quickly about a very unusual case. In the 1910s, there was a Hollywood actor, a Japanese immigrant actor named Seisu Hayakawa. Hayakawa immigrated to the United States when he wanted to pursue a degree in political economics at the University of Chicago, and he dropped out of school and then went to a theater one night and saw a play and fell in love with acting and decided he wanted to become an actor. So he became a regular player at the Japanese Playhouse in Little Tokyo. While he was in a production there, a Hollywood agent discovered him and thought he was so fantastic looking and such a wonderful actor that he actually agreed to pay him $500 a week to star in a silent film, which is an extraordinary amount of money, especially for a non-white actor. And the film was based on a play, and it was called The Typhoon, and that was in 1914. Hayakawa in the film played a Japanese diplomat to France who has an affair with a chorus girl and then strangles her to death in a fit of passion. So this is the negative stereotyping, right? Asian men kill white women and are villains. So he was the lead, but he was, a stereotype nonetheless. Regardless of that, he was so good looking that white women in the audiences they loved him. They thought he was such a sex symbol, and he had this really intense following in the U.S., regardless that he was playing these, terrible villains. He also appeared in Cecil B. DeMille's film The Cheat, which is a similar kind of role where he actually has the first interracial kiss with a white woman on screen. That was 1915. That was the first interracial kiss. And then he brands her with a hot iron because he's, of course, a Chinese villain. So Hayakawa got sick of that after a while, and he didn't want to make, what we call Orientalist roles. They were all stereotypes and not positive in any light. And so he decided to go out on his own, and he actually founded his own movie studio, Hayworth Pictures Corporation, and he released 19 films from that studio between the years of 1918 and 1922, which is extraordinary. There were very few filmmakers or artists of color who were able to create their own studio. Marion E. Wong was one of them. She was born in Oakland and had a very small Mandarin Chinese film company, only made one film. And then we have Hayakawa, who had his film company, and then hopefully you're familiar with Oscar Michaud, who was a legendary Black filmmaker who had his own production company. But that's kind of it. It was very hard to do, and of course they couldn't compete with Hollywood money-wise, production value-wise. So anyway, Hayakawa has his own production studio at this point, and he's making films because and he's the hero of all of them, right? Because he doesn't want to play a stereotype. And sadly, much like in our film you're going to see, even though he isn't a stereotype, all the other actors of color are stereotypes. So his films portrayed him in a positive light, but it had terrible stereotypes about, Chinese and Hispanics and Native Americans and others. So I don't know. Again, and just another disconnect. It's like if you're going to make one group be normal, just do it for everybody. You know, why is there have to be one group that you have to step on? But apparently you do. So anyway, Hayakawa, after he dissolved his film company, he left Hollywood for a while, worked in Europe, and then when he returned to the States, he debuted in his first talking picture in 1931 titled Daughter of the Dragon, alongside rising American star Anna May Wong. So let's talk about Anna May Wong. She had it a little bit tougher than Hayakawa in a sense because, of course, her films are coming out after the censorship code is enacted, so that limits her roles severely. She can't have an interracial kiss on screen the way Hayakawa did, and this is tough for her. But she's an incredible person and had incredible stamina. And she was born in Oakland, California, and from a very young age was intrigued by the newfangled talking pictures or silent era pictures. And she actually appeared in 1922's The Toll of the Sea, which is one of the very first films to ever experiment with a tricolor processing system. So this is an actual color film from 1922, even though it's silent, and that's her in it. So it's really cool. But she was also then cast in other, exotic roles, such as Douglas Fairbanks' The Thief of Baghdad. And yet, even though she was playing these kind of these stereotypes, she was so fashionable. She was one of the first public women to adopt the flapper fashion, and she became this fashion icon and really started achieving international stardom just from her looks and her style. And that didn't hurt her career, but again, roles are limited, right? So she still had to play these stereotypical supporting roles, and it was really rough because she was repeatedly being not just typecast but passed over for actual lead Asian character roles, which were going to non-Asian actresses. So, like Hayakawa, she got fed up and she left the States for a while, went to Europe in about 1928, and made some films over there, most notably the 1929 film Piccadilly, which modern critics, many of them feel like that's her best work. She worked over in Europe for a while, had a lot of success, and then came back, and because of that success and all the training, that she had received, she appeared on Broadway in the play On the Spot, playing a Japanese character, and the director apparently asked her to enact these really stereotypical mannerisms he felt Japanese characters would have, and she refused. She said she wasn't going to do it, and instead she played it the way she wanted to and sort of used her own intuition with her own Chinese mannerisms and whatnot. And it was kind of the beginning of her trying to fight back against this. I mean, in addition to leaving and trying to just give up on Hollywood. So her first talking film was The Flame of Love in 1930, and she recorded that film in French, English, and German, and was really praised for her handling of the three languages. But unfortunately, all three films were not very good and received negative critical reviews. So then we get to 1931, where she accepted her last stereotypical role, and that was in the film Daughter of the Dragon, where she did play alongside Hayakawa, and she played Fu Manchu's vengeful daughter, one of those dragon ladies. And it was just this typically evil kind of Chinese role, and she'd had it. She wasn't going to do it anymore. So that was it for her. So then she got to appear in Shanghai Express in 1932 with Dietrich, which was much better work for her. And that's when she started, even though in Shanghai Express she wasn't playing a stereotype, not the way she had been. She was a more modern type woman. Again, the Chinese press really came down on her. Interestingly enough, Chinese intellectuals and Chinese liberals really didn't give her that hard of a time. And she ended up receiving an honorary doctorate degree from Peking University in 1932, which is incredibly unusual thing to happen, very rare. So she's working along, and she thinks that after Shanghai Express, she's going to start and get these better roles, perhaps. And of course, it doesn't happen. And especially when the code is enforced in 34, she's definitely not going to get any kind of risque or unusual roles. And one of the ones that really broke her heart was the female role in the film The Son-Daughter, which she really wanted, but the studio, MGM, gave it to Helen Hayes, the very Asian Helen Hayes, because she thought that because MGM thought that Anna May Wong was too Chinese to play a Chinese in the film. That's a quote. That's not me. In 1935, however, she really was dealt the most severe blow when MGM also refused to consider her for the leading role of the Chinese character O Lan in the film version of Pearl S. Buck's Good Earth. Wong really lobbied for this role. People in Hollywood who had power and say-so wanted her to have it. The press wanted her to have it. Everyone wanted her to have it. But MGM said no. They gave it to Louise Rayner, who played it in Yellowface, and their line about it, their argument was that the Hays Code, the censorship code, they couldn't buck that. So this is the weird thing. So Paul Muni, who is playing the lead character, right, in this film, is white, and he's in Yellowface, and then Louise Rayner is white and in Yellowface. So their thing was that they couldn't cast Anna May Wong because Paul Muni was white in real life, and so if they kissed or had any love scenes, it would be Chinese and white, Caucasian together. But I don't know, right? It's confusing. I think it's a lot of bull, and everybody thought it was a lot of bull. So anyway, MGM offered Wong a secondary role as a seductress in the film, and she refused it and said, I'm not going to do that. And I think, so, okay, so that was that, and she pretty much had it and decided that, she was only going to take roles that were not stereotypes. Now, because of that, she couldn't be in A pictures anymore. She could not be in these big budget, wonderful films. She had to now make B pictures, lower production films, because that's where she could explore sort of these new characters. And she made two really interesting films with Paramount. One of them is the one we're going to see this week, The Daughter of Shanghai in 1937. But 2 years later, she made another one titled King of Chinatown. So this is the other film that I haven't seen it yet, but I think this might be the other one in which we could say that the lead roles, right, are not stereotypical finally. And what's cool, and I do want to see the second one, I gotta find it. In The King of Chinatown, Wong plays a surgeon, Dr. Mary Ling, who sacrifices a high-paying promotion in order to devote her energies to helping the Chinese fight the Japanese invasion. So that's cool. I want to see that. Any woman as a surgeon in the 1930s would be unusual, and then on top of it, she's Asian American. That's cool. And then, of course, in The Daughter of Shanghai, well, what she did there is Wong took her part, which was very passive in the script and didn't have a lot to do in the story. And she had it all rewritten for her so that her character propelled the story forward, and it was, she was the heroine and did all the moving and shaking in it. And in fact, it was so tailored for her that a lot of people, the studio's working title for it was just the Anna May Wong story, because it was just all her stuff. So that's cool. And Wong told Hollywood Magazine at the time, I like my part in this picture better than any I've had before, because this picture gives Chinese a break. We have a sympathetic part for a change. To me, that means a great deal. Generally, that film that we're going to see this week got positive reviews. Again, it's still B, low budget, so who cares? That's not why we're watching it. But you can enjoy parts of it. It's still, I thought, quite entertaining. And so that's kind of it for Anna May Wong. She, unfortunately, after these two low budget films, she still couldn't get, non-stereotypical roles in big films. So she actually sort of went on the road with her cabaret act, which was very celebrated. Throughout the 40s, she traveled all over the world with this cabaret act in which she sang songs in Cantonese, French, English, German, Danish, and Swedish. And she even attended several socialite events, apparently, at the Mission Inn in Riverside, California in 1941. Who's got pictures? Didn't happen if we don't have the pictures. And for most of World War II, she spent her time helping the Chinese cause against Japan. And any films that she did make, she ended up donating her salary to the effort to fight the invasion of Japan. Then, in 1951, things were starting to look up a little bit. She made history with her television show, The Gallery of Madame Lu Tsong. And this was the first ever U.S. television show that starred an Asian American actress in the lead role. And it aired on the DuPont TV network, which was the fourth network among ABC, CBS, NBC at the time, and it was short-lived, but maybe some of you remember the DuPont television network. They had some cool shows, actually. I think the Goldbergs, the Jewish sitcom, I think that debuted there. They were risk takers. They tried a lot of new stuff. Unfortunately, Anna May Wong's television series is one of those lost series, and apparently what happened is when, I think this is what happened to it, when DuPont was going out of business, there was some kind of lawsuit, and somebody in the company got mad, and they took a truck filled with the celluloid programs, and they dumped them in the river. And that really showed all of us. So there's just no copy of this at all, among many other programs, sadly. So anyway, that was the end of that. And so Wong, she kept doing her cabaret act and acting a little bit, but she was not the star that she had once been, and she had been planning to return to film in The Flower Drum Song in 1961, but sadly she died of a heart attack at the age of 56. Very, very young, and very tragic. For her contribution to the film industry, Anna May Wong received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1960, and she is also depicted as one of the 4 supporting pillars of the Gateway to Hollywood sculpture, which is located on the southeast corner of Hollywood Boulevard and La Brea Avenue. And the other 3 actresses are Dolores Del Rio, who represents the Hispanic American actress, Dorothy Dandridge as African American representation, and then Mae West as the white gal. I approve. I love Mae West. Okay, so I have one more thing that I'm just making sure we're still, yes. Oh, a little bit longer intro than I intended. Very quickly, I want to tell you about Philip Ahn, who is our other lead character in our film this week. Philip Ahn is widely regarded as the first Korean-American film actor in Hollywood. He was born in Highland Park in Los Angeles, and his parents were famous activists and educators who fought for Korean independence from Japanese rule. Ahn had several siblings, and I'll tell you about at least one other of his siblings in a moment, but Ahn was very interested in acting and the theater and film, and his first film was A Scream in the Night in 1935, and he later appeared in a Bing Crosby film, Anything Goes, even though the director had initially rejected him because his English was too good. He also had credited roles in The General Died at Dawn and Stowaway, both opposite Shirley Temple. But our feature film, our film that we're going to see this week, was actually his second credited film role and his first lead role. And what's interesting is that 2 years later, he would appear again with Anna May Wong in King of Chinatown. So these two interesting films both had Anna May Wong and Philip Ahn as the lead characters, and that actually made them the first self-represented on-screen Asian American romantic couple. So it's Spencer and Tracy, but Chinese and Korean. So that was cool, especially for audiences to see. During World War II, Ahn often played Japanese villains in war films and on screen, and that led to some people thinking he was Japanese, and because of all the anti-Japanese sentiment in the country, he then started getting death threats, which was, but fortunately nothing happened. In 1952, Ahn made his television debut on the Schlitz Playhouse, a series that he would appear on several times. And then he started working all over television and everything. He appeared in Hawaiian Eye, Hawaii Five-0, Crossroads, Bonanza, MASH, and all sorts of things. But he probably was best known by modern audiences anyway, as the Kung Fu Master, Master Khan, in the television program Kung Fu, which of course starred white man David Carradine portraying an Asian character. In 1984, Ahn was posthumously inducted into the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and he became the first Korean American film actor to receive that honor. And then a little aside, because I did a deep dive on him, because when I was reading up on Anna May Wong, what I found out was back in the day, she owned a home on San Vicente Boulevard in Santa Monica, and she then converted it into 4 apartments, and they were called the Moongate Apartments. And I thought, okay, that's neat. And she was the landlord there all through the 40s and 50s and up until her death. Then I read that Philip Ahn opened a Chinese or Cantonese restaurant on Van Nuys Boulevard in Panorama City, and he called that the Moongate Restaurant. Moongate both times, so I have to look up Moongate, but it must be a thing. Also, Anna May Wong and Philip Ahn were very good friends, and the press was always asking, are you romantically linked, and are you a couple? And Anna May Wong's like, no, it'd be like dating my brother. But anyway, they both had these establishments they created, Moongate, and I thought, well, that's cool. Phil Ahn's Moongate Restaurant, and that lasted 30 years. It was open from 1954 to 1990. And so I thought, I wonder if there's anything left of that restaurant. And of course, I looked for the apartment complex too for photos. And I did find a photo of Philip Ahn's restaurant. And then I decided to go on eBay. And I found, I didn't feel good purchasing the $200 ashtray, but I did pick up the $10 book of matches. So this is an authentic, unused book of matches from Phil Ahn's Moongate Restaurant. And I think that's cool. And now I just wish I had the power to hold on to it and transport back. Or I'm going to pretend that Anna May Wong handed this to Philip Ahn, or Philip Ahn handed this to Anna May Wong, and that's what I'm going to pretend. So anyway, cool, right? Weird. I like stuff like that. Okay, so lastly, I just wanted to say, just to reiterate that the Ahn family were no slouches. Not only were his famous parents activists, and of course Philip Ahn, the first Korean actor in Hollywood, but Ahn's sister Susan was the first female gunnery officer in the United States Navy and the first Asian American woman to join the Navy, reaching the rank of lieutenant. And she passed away in 2015 at the age of 100. So cool. All right, and that's it. So Daughter of Shanghai, it's a B picture, like I said. Just have fun with it, and you will probably appreciate seeing Anthony Quinn in one of his early roles, and also Buster Crabbe is in there. You know him as Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. So they're in that, and but we're really just there to see Anna May Wong and Philip Ahn lead the picture and lead us through crime and mystery and be our heroes and enjoy that. So enjoy the film, and I will speak with you on Wednesday, and we can talk about all the stuff we talked about. Okay, thanks. Bye.